What was supposed to be a warm, light-hearted morning interview turned into one of the most uncomfortable moments live television had seen in years. When a legendary British actor took his seat in the studio, no one could have predicted that the conversation would shift from friendly promotion to tense confrontation in a matter of seconds. In less than a minute, polite smiles were replaced by stunned silences, and an atmosphere of celebration transformed into something far more volatile. This is the story of a man known for grace under pressure, who was pushed to the point where dignity mattered more than decorum. Michael Caine arrived at the studio as he always did early, composed and impeccably dressed. He wore a tailored suit and his familiar glasses, carrying with him the quiet confidence of someone who had spent over 6 decades in the public eye. A 2-time Academy Award winner and widely respected gentleman of cinema, he was there to discuss his latest memoir, a book filled with reflections on fame, resilience, and life both on and off the screen. Behind the cameras, the crew was buzzing with excitement. They expected laughter, warmth, and stories drawn from a lifetime in film. The audience was equally eager, applauding enthusiastically as the actor greeted the host and took his seat. The lights warmed the set, microphones were checked, and when the broadcast went live, the mood felt effortless and welcoming. At first, the conversation flowed easily. The host asked about the book, and Michael answered with charm and humor. He spoke of growing up in London, his earliest auditions, and the mentors who shaped his career. His words carried the gentle authority of experience, and the audience leaned in, captivated by both his stories and his sincerity. Then, without warning, the tone began to shift. The host's questions subtly sharpened, the warmth in her voice cooling just enough to be noticeable. What appeared to be a casual query carried a hidden barb. She asked whether, given his wealth and lifestyle, he had lost touch with ordinary people. She referenced his tailored suit, his international homes, and suggested that perhaps his talk of humble beginnings no longer rang true. The room fell almost unnaturally silent. Michael paused, then answered calmly. He spoke of his working-class upbringing in South London, of a father who labored as a porter, and of a childhood shaped by discipline and hardship. Those roots, he said, had never left him. They guided every decision he made, both as a man and as an actor. But the questioning didn't soften. Instead, it intensified. The host pressed further, contrasting the struggles of everyday families with his success, implying that comfort and credibility could not exist in the same life. The smile faded slightly from Michael's face. His posture shifted, not in anger, but in disbelief. He replied evenly that he had worked tirelessly for everything he had achieved. That success was not something he would apologize for, and that accomplishing one's dreams did not require abandoning one's values. The tension thickened. Then the conversation veered somewhere far more personal. The host leaned forward and changed direction, pointing not at his career but at his private life, his marriages, his relationships. She implied failure, questioned his commitment, and suggested that moving on from difficult chapters revealed something flawed in his character. A collective breath swept through the audience. This was no longer an interview. It was an intrusion. Michael's expression changed. The weight of the moment was visible in the set of his jaw, and the quiet restraint in his eyes. His personal life had always been something he guarded carefully, not out of secrecy, but out of respect for the people he loved. In that instant, he understood that the conversation had crossed from curiosity into something far more aggressive. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lash out. But there was a stillness that settled over him, a quiet calculation that spoke louder than anger ever could. He realized that staying silent would mean accepting disrespect, not just toward himself, but toward his family and the life he had always tried to protect. And in that realization, everything changed. Because sometimes true professionalism isn't about enduring humiliation for the sake of the spotlight. Sometimes dignity demands a different kind of courage. The courage to step away, to draw a boundary, and to decide that no amount of fame, cameras, or expectation is worth surrendering your self-respect. That was the moment when politeness found its limit, and history was made, not through shouting, but through quiet, unshakable resolve. His jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing. The silence grew heavy, stretching across the studio like a living thing. When he finally spoke, his words were slow and deliberate, chosen with care. "That is a deeply personal subject," he said, his voice steady but edged with restraint, "and it's quite inappropriate to raise it in this setting. My private relationships are not material for gossip." The host laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and waved a hand as if brushing away his discomfort. "Oh, come on," she said lightly. "You wrote a memoir. You put your life out there. You had to know people would want to hear about the interesting parts, not just the neat, polished Hollywood stories." Michael's face hardened. His hands, which had rested calmly on the armrests, tightened into firm grips, fingers curling against the fabric. His voice rose slightly, still controlled, but carrying a new, unmistakable edge. "There's a clear difference between sharing professional experiences and having my personal life picked apart on live television," he said. "I came here to talk about my work, the craft of acting, and the stories that might inspire or entertain people. I did not come here to be ambushed." The word ambushed landed heavily in the air. Behind the scenes, the tension was visible. Camera operators exchanged quick, nervous glances. In the control room, producers spoke urgently into their headsets, their voices low and rapid. Everyone could feel it. The interview was sliding off track, and fast. But the host, either unaware of the damage she was doing or determined to push further, leaned into the moment. "Ambushed," she repeated, her tone dipped in feigned surprise. "I'm just asking questions, Michael. If you can't handle a few straightforward questions, maybe you're not as tough as the hardened characters you play on screen. Maybe the real you is a bit more sensitive than we thought." That was the breaking point. Michael, a man known across the industry for his professionalism and grace, reached his limit. He did not leap to his feet or lash out. Instead, he stood slowly, deliberately, with a calm, measured movement that commanded the room more than any raised voice could. He carefully unclipped the small microphone from his lapel and placed it gently on the table between them. The soft click of metal against glass felt thunderous in the silence. "I've been in this industry for more than 60 years, he said, his voice calm and weighted with experience. "I've been interviewed thousands of times by journalists all over the world. I've faced difficult questions, strong opinions, and intense discussions. But I have never, in all those years, been treated with such open disrespect." He paused, letting the words settle. "This isn't journalism," he continued, "and it isn't entertainment. It's cruelty disguised as conversation." The host tried to interrupt. "Michael, I think you're overreacting." He lifted his hand gently but firmly. "No, I'm not overreacting. I'm responding appropriately to inappropriate behavior. You've questioned my character, invaded my private life, and dismissed my work. Not to create understanding, but to manufacture conflict for ratings. I won't take part in that." The studio went completely silent. Nearly 200 people, the audience, the crew, and even the host herself, watched as he prepared to leave. The atmosphere was no longer tense, it was reverent. The host, perhaps finally understanding the consequences of what she had done, tried to soften her tone. "Michael, please sit down. Let's start over. I didn't mean—" "You meant every word," he said quietly, cutting her off without raising his voice. "That's what makes this so disappointing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an accident. It was a choice. And now I'm making one as well." He turned toward the exit. Then came the final mistake. As he stepped away, the host called after him with a sharp edge to her voice. "Running away, Michael? How brave of you. I suppose the mighty actor can't handle a little heat from a Scottish woman half your size." He stopped. Slowly, he turned back. For a fleeting moment, everyone in the studio thought anger might finally surface. Instead, what appeared on his face was something far more powerful: sadness and deep disappointment. "This has nothing to do with handling heat," he said quietly, his voice lowered, controlled, and steady. And with that, the room understood that what they had just witnessed was not a tantrum, but a boundary, drawn clearly, calmly, and without regret. "This has everything to do with recognizing when a conversation turns toxic," he said quietly, "on having enough self-respect to step away from it. I hope, for your sake, that you reflect on what happened here today. I truly do." With that, he turned and walked off the set. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of his exit. The host remained seated, her expression caught somewhere between shock and stubborn defiance, as if she couldn't fully process what had just unfolded in front of millions of viewers. In the audience, a low murmur began, rising from whispers to open conversation. Some people began to applaud. Others sat frozen, stunned by the sudden end to what had started as an ordinary morning interview. But what happened in those final moments didn't come out of nowhere. The tension hadn't appeared suddenly. It had been building almost from the beginning. After the early, polite exchanges about his memoir, The host's questions began to change in tone. They were no longer curious, they were edged with subtle barbs. At first, Michael met them with calm humor and thoughtful replies. He deflected awkward framing with professionalism, never raising his voice, never showing irritation. But the hostility was there, just beneath the surface. When she questioned whether he had lost touch with ordinary people, he didn't become defensive. Instead, he answered with honesty. He spoke of his childhood, a father working long hours in a fish market, a mother cleaning houses to keep food on the table, a cramped apartment, and a shared bedroom with his brother. He spoke of missed meals and cold nights, not for sympathy, but to explain the foundations that shaped him. These weren't anecdotes. They were his memories. They were dismissed. The host cut him off mid-story, brushing it aside as nostalgia that didn't change reality. She pointed out the homes, the wealth, the royal invitations, and implied he could hardly claim to be a man of the people anymore. He took a breath before answering. "Success," he said, "does not erase where you come from. It doesn't mean you've betrayed your roots." He acknowledged the privilege of opportunity and the gratitude he carried for it, but insisted he had never pretended to be someone he wasn't. That's when the tone crossed from discomfort into something darker. The host shifted to his marriages. The phrasing wasn't curious. It was accusatory. She emphasized the number, 2 marriages, like evidence entered into a trial. She suggested patterns of failure, moral weakness, and inability to commit. He visibly recoiled, but still answered with dignity. He spoke of love loss and the family he was proud of. He made it clear that reducing deeply personal experiences to tabloid sound bites wasn't journalism. It was cruelty. But the questions didn't stop. They sharpened. She turned her attention to his current wife, asking if the age difference was an attempt to recapture youth, to deny aging. The studio audibly reacted. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The intent was unmistakable. Michael's face flushed, but he kept control. He described his wife as brilliant, accomplished, and deeply loved. He rejected the suggestion that their relationship was anything other than genuine connection, calling the implication offensive to them both. Then came the phrase that shifted everything. When the host referred to his wife as a trophy, the air changed. His voice grew quieter, more controlled. He corrected her carefully. His wife, he said, was not an object, not an accessory. She was a full human being with her own life and achievements. He told her plainly that such language said far more about her than it did about him or his marriage. The host smirked. That small expression, the satisfaction, said everything. Touched a nerve, she asked. He answered simply that she had crossed a line. There was a difference between tough journalism and personal attacks. What she was doing fell squarely into the latter. Then came the remark that tipped the balance completely. The insinuation that he was too fragile, too sensitive to handle real questions. In that moment, the conversation stopped being a conversation at all. It became something poisonous, and what the world later saw as a dramatic walkout was in truth the final act of a man who had endured escalating disrespect for far longer than he ever should have had to. She had questioned his toughness, compared him unfavorably to the characters he'd made famous, and implied he was weaker than the public believed. For a man whose entire life had been built on discipline, integrity, and quiet strength, it was perhaps the deepest insult she could have delivered. It wasn't just criticism. It was an attempt to strip away his dignity on live television. The interview itself had begun nearly 20 minutes earlier under entirely different circumstances. For the first few minutes, everything had felt natural and warm. Michael had been charming, funny, and open. He'd shared stories about almost working with Stanley Kubrick, about his long-standing friendship with Sean Connery, and about a moment early in his career when he had nearly turned down one of his most iconic roles, simply because he doubted he was right for it. The audience had been completely captivated. The host had seemed attentive, asking thoughtful follow-up questions that suggested she had genuinely read his book and understood his journey. For a time, it felt like the kind of interview viewers loved, relaxed, insightful, and full of humanity. Then, without warning, the mood shifted. Whether it came from a producer's note or a personal decision to raise the stakes, something changed in the host's approach. The questions stopped being curious and became confrontational. What had been conversation slowly transformed into interrogation. And Michael, a man who had navigated difficult interviews with grace for more than 60 years, found himself backed into a corner where silence felt like surrender. In that moment, walking away was no longer dramatic. It was dignified. Before he left, There was a brief window of time, a few crucial moments, that revealed the true heart of the conflict. This wasn't just about a guest walking off a set. It was about a clash of values: respect versus spectacle, substance versus shortcuts, dignity versus the desperate hunger for viral moments. Michael stood there holding the small microphone in his hand, studying it almost sadly. "This little device," he said quietly, lifting it slightly, "is meant to amplify voices. It's meant to help share stories and ideas. But too often now, it's used to amplify cruelty instead." He placed it down gently on the table, carefully, precisely, as if even in anger he refused to treat another person's belongings without respect. The host shifted uncomfortably. Her confidence, which had earlier felt unshakable, began to flicker. "I'm just doing my job," she said, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. This is what interviews look like now. People want authenticity. They want real conversations, not polished promotional appearances. Michael shook his head slowly. "Authenticity doesn't require cruelty," he replied, "and real conversations don't require tearing someone down. You can ask difficult questions without being disrespectful. You can explore sensitive topics without being unkind. The fact that those lines feel blurred to you is troubling." "So what would you have me do?" she asked. "Just throw you soft questions. Let you sit here and promote your book without any real depth?" "I would have you treat me like a human being," he said simply. "Ask me hard questions about my work, about my choices, about the industry. But don't attack my family. Don't mock my relationships. Don't suggest that success has somehow made me less than what I was." There is a world of difference between those approaches. The audience responded before anyone could stop it. Applause, spontaneous and strong, filled the studio. It was a clear show of support, and it caught the host off guard. She glanced toward the crowd, then back at him, and for a brief moment uncertainty crossed her face. Then it hardened. And that was when she made the final disastrous remark. The comment about him running away, about not being able to handle heat from a woman half his size. It was designed to belittle him, to humiliate him, to reduce a lifetime of achievement to a cheap punchline. It failed. Because his response, calm, clear and grounded, cut through the room. His words about recognizing toxic situations and having the self-respect to walk away resonated in a way that no insult ever could. He turned toward the exit. His posture was straight. His pace was measured. The camera followed every step. And in his face there was no anger, only disappointment. The look of a man who had expected better, who had hoped for respect, and who had instead been shown something far less human. The door closed behind him with a soft, final click, and with that sound, the moment was over. Lorraine sat alone in her chair while the studio fell into an uneasy silence around her. The audience stared, unsure whether to speak, applaud, or simply absorb what they had just witnessed. She tried to smile, tried to pull herself back into the rhythm of live television. "Well," she said, her voice slightly too bright, slightly too forced. "That was certainly unexpected. Michael Caine, everyone. Leaving the interview a bit early. We'll take a short break and be right back." But nothing about the moment felt recoverable. In the control room, producers spoke urgently over one another, headsets pressed tight against their ears. Across social media, the first clips were already spreading, grainy screen recordings, shocked captions, and rapidly multiplying reactions. What had been designed as a warm promotional segment for a memoir had turned into a textbook example of how quickly trust can be destroyed on live television. The contrast between the two figures at the center of the storm made the situation even more striking. Michael Caine had spent more than 6 decades in the public eye without controversy. He was known as a gentleman, someone who treated directors, assistants, and catering staff with equal courtesy. No scandals, no public feuds, no cruel words about colleagues. His reputation had been built not only on talent, but on character. Lorraine, by contrast, had built her career on warmth. She was the familiar face of morning television, known for putting guests at ease. Her studio was meant to feel safe, a place of relaxed conversation where people could be genuine rather than defensive. Politicians, musicians, actors, they had all trusted her platform because it felt human. But that morning, she abandoned everything that had made her brand trusted. She traded warmth for antagonism, curiosity for cruelty, connection for conflict. The question people would ask afterward was simple: why? Why conduct the interview this way? Why provoke a man who had done nothing to deserve hostility? Why continue pushing when it was obvious she was crossing lines? Theories would emerge for weeks. Pressure from producers, a hunger for viral moments, a misjudged attempt at edgier commentary. But in that moment, none of the speculation mattered. What mattered were the facts, the words spoken, the respect violated, and the decision that followed. Michael Caine's walkout wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't ego. It wasn't theatrics. It was a measured response to an impossible situation. He had given her chances to change direction. He had answered with patience. He had tried to steer the conversation back to meaningful ground. But once it was clear the confrontation was intentional, not accidental, he made the only dignified choice left. And that choice came with a cost. He was in the middle of promoting a book. Walking away meant risk, negative headlines, awkward questions, and the possibility of public misunderstanding. It meant stepping directly into controversy rather than quietly completing a press tour. But he decided something mattered more. Self-respect, human dignity, basic decency. In the seconds after he left, the toll of the moment became visible. At the edge of the frame, crew members looked shaken. Some shook their heads. Others avoided the camera entirely. One boom operator quietly set down his equipment and stepped away from the set, unable to keep working after what he'd seen. This was no longer just about one guest. It had become about everyone who felt complicit for staying silent. During the commercial break, the stage manager approached Lorraine. Their conversation was intense and private, but her expression shifted visibly, from defensive to uncertain to something close to panic. The realization was setting in. This wasn't going to be forgotten. This wouldn't blow over. This moment would follow her career in a way no amount of previous goodwill could erase. Meanwhile, Michael Caine had already left the building. Those who saw him said he walked calmly to his car, declined comment and drove away. No outbursts, no slammed doors, no drama. Just quiet, deliberate removal from a situation he refused to tolerate. The interview had been scheduled for 30 minutes. It ended after 22. Those final 8 minutes, the tension, the escalation, the collapse, would be studied endlessly. Media analysts would break them down. Journalism schools would teach them as lessons in what not to do. Public relations experts would call it a perfect case study in how to manufacture a crisis. But in that moment, it wasn't theory. It was simply a man who had finally had enough. A man who remained patient, gracious, and composed until silence became complicity. A man who chose dignity over compliance, self-respect over spectacle. And that choice, quiet and steady, said more than any argument ever could.